welcome to the first of our series. You remember we introduced the series last week. Very pleased to introduce Tim Newburn of the department. Tim has been Professor of Criminology and Social Policy for 2 decades. Yeah, he's been head of the department, but he does research, lots of it, many articles. He's got his name on over 40 books, including this one. He's written a very famous textbook about criminology, and there's a whole case of Tim's stuff outside that door you can have a look at afterwards. His research areas span policing, restorative justice, youth justice, drugs and alcohol, comparative social policy making, and urban violence. He led the LSE team that worked with The Guardian on the riots work that was around 2011 that became a 2014 REF impact case study. He's currently working, as we heard last week, on official histories of criminal justice in the UK with David Downs and Paul Rock. But today we're talking about Orderly Britain, which, as Tim has referred to, as a trade book. So it's more popular, all of us can understand it. I guess if you think about a system of social order in a country, it's a mixture of, on the one hand, top-down social control via formal mechanisms such as a system of laws, criminal justice system with rules and formal institutions. And on the other hand, you've got bottom-up informal social mechanisms, and that's what we're hearing about today. So everything from, well, as it says there, dog fouling to double parking, public toilets, queuing, and the pandemic in between. And the Queen died very conveniently to provide a great case study for Tim's book. The queue.
Wasn't quite how I put it. But thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming, Stephen. Thank you for the very kind introduction and for the invitation and for organising all of this. So I'm going to talk about this book, Orderly Britain. You can see the subtitle. Stephen said a little bit about some of the things that, some of the contents. You'll see that there's a euphemism on the front cover. It says dog fouling. Stephen's just pointed out to me, Amazon says dog mess. My elderly mother uttered the word shit for the first time when she opened the contents page. I thought maybe I won't use it. I was a rather proud moment, actually. So look, what I plan to do is just talk about the kind of apology in advance is this is probably going to, undoubtedly, not probably, going to be a significantly less scholarly talk than the ones that will be forthcoming in the series, but I'll hope to kind of entertain the next 40 minutes or so. A little bit with some of the things that Stephen just talked about in relation to the nature of social order and management creation of social order in the post-war period, using some of these very kind of everyday, quotidian elements of our lives, which I think most people looking down that list ought to be able to relate to some of these. It's intended to be deliberately a quirky book, a kind of semi-serious book, a light-hearted but light touch kind of scholarly look at the post-war period. So it's a piece of social history without the kind of usual accoutrements of social history. So it's not about the kind of big issues of politics or the economy or cultural and social change. It's much more on it's problematic too. It's much more on the everyday, the quotidian, the banal. What the French writer Georges Perec would have called the infra-ordinary and endotic, opposed to the extraordinary and the exotic, or what the anthropologist Gearing would have called people as oddities. So quirky and quotidian is the approach. The book, I mean, I'll jump to the conclusion very briefly. I like to think of the book as being broadly uplifting. It's a positive tale. It's a happy story, I think. And I'll come back to that perhaps at the end. But as such, I think maybe I've made a bit of a mistake here. And I partly, you know, like most things, I mean, I wrote this because I had something I felt I wanted to write. But the Stephen was saying it's a trade book. And by trade, I mean sort of two things there. One, it's not published by an academic publisher, it's published by a mainstream fiction stroke non-fiction publisher. It's aimed at a rather different audience from academic books, but also it's trade books and trying to sell it. But I'm not sure that the sales pitch here is quite wrong. If you go to whatever Smiths or Waterstones or Hatchards or the railway bookstore, they're full now of non-fiction books about some aspect of the state of the nation or the state of the world. And by and large, I think those books tend to be characterized by what I've referred to here as miserablism and declinism. Nothing seems to sell better than that sense of we're all going to hell in a handcart. Why aren't things the way they used to be? It's all dreadful. And then maybe, what can we do about it? I'll give you a couple of little examples here from our, as it were, one of our favorite kind of quasi-naturalized Americans in the UK, Bill Bryson, who has written a couple of very well-known books about the British Isles. The more famous of the two, his first Notes from a Small Island in the mid-1990s. He said he talked about the deference and quiet consideration for others that's a fundamental part of British life. Lived here a couple of decades, and by 2015, as you'll see from his face, he's looking considerably more concerned. And he's saying, now lots of people are governed not so much by whether something is right or wrong, but by whether they think anyone's watching. And it speaks very much, I think, to what seems to me to be a kind of dominant discourse in the take on modern social history. And this book just sadly does something rather different. I think it's not a tale of miserablism and declinism. But let's see where we go with it. So maybe I'm pitching it wrong if I'm trying to say. Let's see. So just go back. What I'm going to do is very quickly give you a kind of cook's tour of a bit of this book. So rather than any kind of deep dive into any of the particular subjects, just going to scoot across the surface of them. Largely, on the one hand, to give you a sense of the book, but B, because actually I'm not sure it's possible to dive that deeply into any of these. I don't think I have dived that deeply anyway. So I'm going to go through this and going to say a little bit about dogs and dog mess. Going to talk a little about smoking and drinking and queuing and parking. I'm happy to talk about the other things, but if I can get through those in the next 25 minutes or so, then I've given you a sense of what's between the covers here. So, dog poop, dog mess, dog detritus, dog shit. This is the beginning of the book. So the book grew out of, as it were, the dog compost. The original idea for this occurred to me on a wharf with my elderly aunt quite a few years ago now, longer than I care to remember, really. We were out walking down a quiet Oxfordshire lane. She had a little dog with her. This is a road where, almost no one sensible walks. It's just your little cars whizzing by, but it was the road from her house towards the village. So she used to use it, trotting along with her dog. And as dogs do, we stopped at some stage, verge of the road, did its business. And she got a bag out of her pocket and bent down and I don't have a dog, so I scooped this up, tied it up, and off we walked. Now, I grew up in, the place doesn't matter, but I grew up in Merseyside in the 1960s. You could not move through pavements there for dog turds, bless me. It was a minefield. If someone in the 1960s had bent down with a biodegradable, such things existed, plastic bag and picked up that detritus, people would have thought they were bonkers. They would have thought they were mad, possibly actually thought there was something wrong with them. So the question then emerged of what's happened? We've moved in that period of 30, 40, 50 years from a nation that skirts these things to one in which picking up after dogs is an embedded social expectation. How and why? So very quickly, the story is essentially one, I think, sociologically of the creation, the emergence and creation of a social problem and the establishment of new social norms in relation to that social problem. It emerged in the 1970s, and it emerged initially as a health problem. So toxocariasis or toxocaris, a kind of a health-related concern linked to roundworms, worms in dog feces, and what was believed to be the dangers to human health were such worms to get, for example, into people's eyes. And there have been a few reported cases, for example, of children, one losing the sight in an eye and various other things. So it became initially, as it were, initially identified as a health concern. And that health concern started to get some publicity via the television, and in particular, a program on Thames Television, as it then was, called The Case Against Dogs. And bizarrely enough, or interestingly enough, was picked up by a council in Lancashire, Burnley Council, some of whose members had watched this program and become particularly concerned about this new problem, and decided, without consultation, to take action, indeed to take drastic action. And what they decided to do was to ban dogs from 3 of their local parks entirely. So overnight, they introduced bylaws. They introduced now a series of rules which said pet owners can no longer walk their dogs in these public parks. So far, so good. Health problem, local council reaction, then citizens' reaction. What then happened was the dog owners actually became pretty spectacularly unhappy at this and decided actually that what was required was some pushback. And what emerged was a campaign of civil disobedience. That campaign of civil disobedience involved things like what were called walk-ins, so as it were, mass trespass, if you like, with dogs in the local parks. There was a vigil held outside the Prime Minister, outside number 10 Downing Street. It wasn't blocked off in those days. You could walk up and down the street. So they took their dogs and camped outside then Jim Callahan's residence in Downing Street and had what they called, probably has different connotations these days, had what they called a dog-in. Not what you're thinking, I fear. This went on. So the kind of back and forth of social reaction, social action and reaction, the kind of classic sort of tales of moral panic on the one hand, but in this case, as it were, the emergence of the social problem, led eventually to a series of court cases. Cut a long story short, from the local magistrates' court to the Court of Appeal, through fines for the breaking of bylaws to the eventual imprisonment of 2 of the dog owners for failure to abide by the law. Now, of course, the importance of all this is that what that does is as it would cement this as a problem in the kind of political and public mind. Now, no one followed Burnley's example. To my knowledge, there are no other places where the response to this apparent problem was the banning of dogs. But what it did do was it put it on the governmental agenda. And slowly but surely over the next decade or so, local councils started to bring in bylaws to try to require people to dispose of the mess, to pick up after dogs, eventually leading to, after kind of local governmental pressure, to central government responding with kind of model bylaws and things, and central government legislation for various parts of public land, again, to try to inculcate similar forms of behavior. Now, at the time, Burnley unusually and unlikely, was twinned with New York here. Now, New York, as is so often the case with so many things like everything, I don't know, zero tolerance policing, likes to think of itself as the source of all sorts of new ideas. And it claims for itself the city in which so-called poop scoop laws actually emerged. But they emerged about the same time as Burnley. So there's a bit of a competition here. But in New York, they were in a sense slightly more thoughtful about this. They didn't do the kind of straight into banning dogs thing. They consulted, they figured out, as it were, what might be a practical solution to this problem, and started, and in 1976-77 introduced poop scoop laws to require local citizens and dog owners to pick up after their dog. And slowly but surely, I think, that where these social expectations have spread. Paris, by contrast, for many years thought that the punishment and threats and deterrence and so forth was not the way forward, and preferred to visit with a carrot and stick. And had a variety of absolutely wonderful initiatives for trying to both indicate and to change standards of social behavior. So it built dog toilets, can you see them? But most beautifully, and I wish I'd seen some of these, we still see pictures of them. It had on the streets of Paris what were called motocrottes, which were scooters, on the back of which were large containers. And the driver of the scooter had a vacuum hose and would travel the streets of Paris, scooping up, sucking up. Oh, that's horrible. Sorry. Anyway, neither of these things solved the problem. And eventually, late 1990s, Paris followed the model of other Western towns and cities and began to introduce what we now see as kind of poop scoop laws. So just very quickly on this, all I want to say for now before moving on to smoking and drinking is with dog poop, I think it is in some ways, I think, a kind of classic tale of the creation of a social problem, the identification and creation through claims making of a social problem. It gets sold originally as a health problem, but that actually quite quickly disappears. And quite soon, even though they're not talking about it, it's clear from places like Burnley that what's really being talked about is civic pride and public space and the management of urban places. And then finally, for our purposes here, for my purposes here, just want to observe that most of this, with the exception of poor old Mavis Thornton, as her name, who was the first person jailed as a result of her civil disobedience in Burnley. With the exception of those people, actually most of this has occurred with a remarkable lack of fuss. I describe it in the book as a silent social revolution. And it's one that's been achieved despite the proliferation of bylaws and in bits and pieces of central government legislation. It's essentially a tale of informal social control and changing social expectations and norms. And I'll come back to the word responsible, but much to my surprise in the many years that this took to write, the kind of spectre of Michel Foucault became ever more prominent in the ways in which I sort of started to think about these things. And this is essentially a tale of the governing of the responsible citizen, the whole book, or in this case, the responsible doggo. Smoking, really quickly. So I won't ask you how many people smoke here, but I'm guessing not many, a few. The history of smoking in this country in the post-war period has gone through three phases, essentially. In the initial post-war period, ubiquitous and fashionable, and encouraged, thought in many circles to be medically, physically beneficial, as well as cool and fashionable and so forth. Then subsequently, from the sort of late 50s, 60s onwards, became transformed into a health-related issue and a source of individual risk. And the establishment of the link between lung cancer and tobacco, which was established in the very early 1950s, slowly but surely becomes as it were, the increasingly dominant discourse. But two things about smoking here. First is what's I think on one level interesting is just how long it took from the emergence of actually very convincing scientific evidence of cancer-related health risks of smoking and the eventual public ban that was introduced in 2006, 2007, over half a century. Partly as a consequence of governmental reluctance to intervene in individual behavior, partly as a result of the potential loss to the exchequer of decline in smoking, and partly as a result of the extraordinary success of the industry in continuing to sell and promote tobacco and tobacco-related products. In terms, though, of what's happened subsequently in thinking about the kind of gradual and then, as it were, tipping point and eventually quite sudden public ban, I think what we're looking at here is quite an interesting shift in utilitarian arguments. But as I was sort of implying, I think for much of the period after the emergence of Doll and Bradford Hill's research, the key defense of smoking by those in favor, by smokers and by the industry, was essentially a utilitarian one, that one should only intervene in people's lives in order to protect against harm. And the defense here was that smokers essentially are only harming themselves. The key, the tipping point, is the, in inverted commas, discovery of passive smoking. Passive smoking, and thereby the creation of, again, air quotes, innocent victims. The idea that it is no longer the smoker just harming themselves, but it's the smoker harming others. So it shifts from a health problem and a matter of individual risk into an issue of public health and a social problem. Drinking. Okay. Drinking's an interesting one. What has happened to alcohol and alcohol consumption in this country over the last 75 years? First 50 years, broadly speaking, first 50 years of those 75 years, general consumption in the population was going up, and going up quite substantially after a drop in the first half of the century, broadly speaking. In the last 20 years, alcohol consumption has plateaued and has begun to drop across almost all age groups, very crudely speaking. The story, the kind of regulatory story here is a complex one, in that issues of taxation and licensing and availability and costs and the ways in which alcohol or drinking is talked are simultaneously as stories, as it were, of liberalization and restriction. Alcohol's cheaper, alcohol's more easily available, alcohol can be bought from a far wider range of sources than once was the case. The hours in which one can buy alcohol are now significantly greater than would have been the case just 30 or 40 years ago, and so forth. And yet, when you start to look at those places and in which we can, and how drinking is talked about and thought about, and the ways in which, as it were, we are encouraged and advised to both think and behave in relation to alcohol, then the picture becomes more complex. So we've seen, as it were, the emergence of a whole range of quite complex health concerns around alcohol. And again, going back to the words I was using before about responsible dog owners, the creation of the sensible or responsible drink. So those things with which we will all be, well, in Britain at least, familiar, the idea of units of alcohol. What are they? How many can we drink? Well, broadly speaking, probably no one knows what the answer to that question is. We may have if we did a little poll, we might have a rough idea of what the kind of recommended weekly or daily intake is. but actually that's all pretty vague. It's not the same here as it is in other countries, and it's not the same now as it was previously. When units were first introduced as an advisory thing, the number of units, when units were first officially talked about by governments in this country, the recommended, I'm going back in time now, I'm going to live there, the recommended weekly intake was 56 units. I'm in. It's the first time for years I've been told the limit for them. Anyway, 56 units. And so it keeps on coming down. What's it based on? Well, probably increasingly based on elements of temperature elements. But a huge amount of this is kind of back at the, excuse the phrase, really English, is back at the fag packet, really. Though no one has them. Calculations. So we've got health concerns. We've had safety concerns. So the most obvious one is drinking. Drinking and driving, which radically changed one aspect of British social life, albeit that it changed it in ways that are different from, say, Scottish social life. So the blood alcohol levels that are allowed in England are significantly more liberal than those that are allowed in Scotland, and vary very differently from other countries. But also the ways in which those things are enforced are very different. So the motoring lobby very successfully, and indeed the alcohol lobby very successfully, managed to prevent the introduction of random breath testing. So again, that's something that is really quite an interesting difference between us and other nations, but also quite a significant limit or break on the degree to which these things are enforced, or the ways in which they're enforced. We've increasingly had, with alcohol, health concerns have given way to concerns around crime, antisocial behaviour, and insecurity. And now if one looks at central government alcohol policy, you'll see that its aims and objectives are almost entirely cast around issues of crime and antisocial behaviour. And much of that, I would say, is to do with governing the young, the management of the youth, or particular categories of youth. But again, so much of the way in which drinking, alcohol consumption is, or elements of alcohol consumption is regulated, is again, like smoking and like dogmas, to do with the management of urban, or the management of public space, and the ways in which we think about it. Huge, though, moral change in some areas. So very occasionally, and very enjoyably, Lucinda organised one just 2 or 3 weeks ago, we have, as it were, an afterwork event in which we, in this case, went to the George and we had a few drinks, and very pleasant it was too. But they're very much thought, I think, although it may not be spoken explicitly, as afterwork events. We live in a world now where alcohol consumption and work, unless it's down the street, are things that don't go together. Now, that's a very, very recent change, extraordinarily recent change. So I'm an old police researcher, so will remember these things too. I remember vividly my first experience of going out to do police research, going into the superintendent's office who was in charge of the station and doing the usual 30 or 40 minutes of what we were doing and how we were going to behave, and then being handed over to CID. And we went down the pub. And we went down the pub and we spent an hour and a half or something in the pub. And I have no, well, for obvious reasons, I have no memory of how much was drunk, but it was a lot. At which point the cops then went back out in cars as well as on foot to do their jobs. No one blinking and batting an eye, thinking there was anything unusual there. Including probably me in one of them. The Home Office, which we both used to work in, had a bar in the canteen, in the restaurant. Not that many people used it, but it was there. And if anyone went for a drink, no one thought twice about it. And just because I enjoy the story. This is from David Nobbs, who's maybe a name not familiar to most people. He was a writer. He wrote a lot of stuff for television. He's most famous for a series many years ago called The Fall and Rise of Reginald Harry. but he wrote for a lot of very well-known TV and radio people. And this is him. This is him talking about 1970s when he was writing for the Les Dawson show. And he says the following: "My drink in those days in the bar at Yorkshire Television was a gin and double Cinzano Bianco. And I used to, and I say, that's at least 3 units there. And I used to buy the first round because I wouldn't expect anyone to buy that. And I would sip it, and when anyone offered me a drink, I would ask for a Cinzano or a gin. And by the time I'd finished my first gin and double Cinzano, 3 rounds would have elapsed, and I'd have another gin and double Cinzano. By the end of lunch break, I'd have had a third. So this meant that at least 7 rounds had to have been bought for this to happen. And then we all went and did good work again in the afternoon. Astonishing. And anyone who's familiar with Private Eye will be familiar with their fictitious journalist lunchtime booze.
Fleet Street, of course.
Fleet Street, the city, but just generally. But again, a second silent social revolution, I think. And that, I think, I mean, I made that quick about Downing Street. Clearly a lot of the anger that emerged during and in the aftermath of the pandemic about some of the alleged behaviour at the top of government related to, most of it, failure to obey the rules that had been set by government from which others were expected to behave. But at least some, I think, of the astonishment about some of the behaviour was just the sheer incredulity that that's how people behave at work. Wine fridges and all the rest of it felt so anachronistic in an age where these things are essentially no longer allowed. Queuing. Stephen mentioned the queue for the Queen. I went down, I might talk about it later if we have questions. I was doing a few radio interviews about queuing, and I kept being asked about the queue for the Queen, as it were. And I realized that, I was busking really. Hypothesizing what people were doing, why they were doing it, so forth. So I went down for an hour or so to talk to people. Queuing very quickly. The importance of queuing, it's obviously it's poncily put, it's a fairness management system. It's the way in which we deal with problems of supply and demand. We line them. Now, there's a wonderful, wonderful experiment by the famous American psychologist Stanley Milgram, who was famous for the very controversial, probably deeply, deeply unethical experiment, which involved volunteers giving the hypothetical electric shocks to their subjects and so forth. As a psychologist, he was interested in obedience. And so one of the things he studied was queues, a really, really interesting experiment. He got postgraduate students to queue jump. So they were given a little bit of training, and they were observed by Milgram and his team. What they were asked to do was to find a queue of probably 6 to 7 people in length, and then politely insert themselves in between the 3rd and the 4th person in the queue by saying, "Excuse me, I would like to get in." And so Milgram and his colleagues then watched this experiment, in order to see how people responded. Now, the responses are entirely predictable. Okay, people were upset. Of course, they were upset because this breaks all the kind of the normative surroundings of queuing, fairness, and all the rest of it. Also found, again, I think very predictably, that the people behind the person who pushed in were angrier than the person in front, because of course then they're the ones who are really missing. They're the ones who are really missing out. Actually, in many respects, it's all fine. So far, to my eyes, so far. Great, it's good we know it. The really interesting thing I felt about this study, which Milgram only kind of reports as almost as an afterthought, is they also studied the students. So they were there, obviously watching this. So the final thing I should have said is the students just stayed there for a maximum couple of minutes and then left the queue. They didn't actually, in the end, disappear. They were watching, so the academics were watching the students. The really interesting thing is what they report is many of the students took 15, 20, 30 minutes to garner the courage to push into the queue. Some of them reported feeling almost physically sick at the prospect of having to do so. Now, which illustrates better than anything else the strength of the norms that exist around queuing. Now, very quickly on queuing, the conceit. So there's a quote here from the Anglo-Hungarian journalist George Mikes, who in a book called How to Be an Alien 75 years ago said, an Englishman, even if he's alone, forms an orderly queue of one. The conceit is that we are a nation that queues. We're a nation that likes to queue and a nation that's good at queuing. That's the conceit. Now, the interesting thing about that is, well, it is obviously a conceit. Anyone who's traveled knows that we're hardly alone in lining up for things. We do it differently in different places and at different times, but queuing, if not ubiquitous, is very widespread. So the idea that somehow this is uniquely or very obviously British is, as I say, a conceit. But it's a conceit, I think, that was established around about the time of the Second World War. And in particular, the restrictions on foodstuffs and other things. You know, the maid queuing during the war and in the aftermath of the war, an everyday facet of life, in particular for women who were the bulk of those who were responsible or who undertook shopping on behalf. And I think the association between queuing and the war effort and the British stiff upper lip is essentially the thing that kind of begins that process of establishing it as something which becomes somehow identified with British national character. Quite quickly, however, the associations become negative. By the early 1950s, Winston Churchill, who lost office at the end of the Second World War when the Attlee government came to power, in looking for ways to portray the Conservative Party as a modernising party and as one that would replace what he wanted to present as a failing Labour administration, talked about Labour's world being not utopia, but utopia. A world in which, despite the end of the war, despite all the promises of better times, of sunlit uplands and so forth, people were still queuing. 20 years later, the Thatcher opposition in the late 1970s via Saatchi and Saatchi start using the queue as a means similarly of as the basis of their criticism of Callaghan's Labour administration under the banner Labour isn't working. And those things in many ways I think would cement the queue in national consciousness and form at least part of the reason that it remains associated with who we are and what might make us different. Now, two quick points on queuing before I move on. I ought to stop for a second. The first is that at the end of the chapter on queuing here, I think the final sentence says something along the lines of, we continue to queue, but less and less do so under conditions of our own choosing. That's a nod in the direction. One of the reasons for this is, I think, that one of the things that we've experienced in the last 20 or 30 years is the formalization of queuing. But something that emerges as at least partially spontaneous social solution to a particular problem becomes a way of managing the population or parts of the population in particular circumstances. So anyone now, for example, who goes to the post office or to an airport or particularly to a supermarket will now find themselves in a very carefully governed line. What used to be multiple queues have now been replaced by single queues because of the problem of multiple queues is trying to choose which is the best one. The theory being the single queue gives you at least a sense that we're all in it together. It's a shared queue, and then we'll get called forward, which is the scientific queue management terminology, to a till. Of course, now we're encouraged to, within supermarkets, to be self-checkout people as well. But essentially what you've got going on here is the application of various techniques to do two things. Essentially to instill what Irving Goffman called queue discipline, to manage, to govern, to discipline the queue. But of course, in corporate terms, to turn, horrible phrase, queue flow into cash flow. We're being managed in order, or more importantly, and back to food co-pass, we're being encouraged to manage ourselves here in ways which will make the whole process quicker and more profitable. And in doing so, actually, it's not just the queue that's being managed, or not just us that's being managed, but it's the experience of the queue that's being managed. That is, queues are regularly experienced as what sociologists would call examples of thick time, slow moving time. And now, actually, there are a whole series of ways in which time, at least it is hoped, is thinned by giving us things to do or think about or buy, even if we're lucky, while we queue. Finally on this, the formalization of queuing now extends in our modern liberal, if you like, neoliberal times, into the formalization of queue jumping. Queue jumping is the new means of profit extraction. So poor old Stanley Milgram and the experiments and so forth, the fairness management system is no longer in any way fair. It's now about how much cash you go to a theme park, you go to an airport, go anywhere else. My real hate, you want to buy concert tickets. Now you can buy premium ones or premium access, or it's custom. But again, it's another way in which the queue is being, as it were, organized, managed, and disciplined in order to achieve certain things. We may come back. I was going to say we may come back to the point, but I'm going to run out of time. So one word, which is irony. I started by saying the association with queuing, the British national character, is a conceit. It's a fiction, at least to a degree. There are elements which we might think of as being British, as distinct from forms of French or Italian queuing, who knows what else. But queuing as a thing, as a form of human behavior, is not distinct British. But that notion that somehow we're a nation of queuers is now firmly established once again, as it were, not just in British public consciousness, but international consciousness. The idea that we would have a 9-mile queue for 3 days, which would end with the establishment of a queue to get into the queue. Wonderful. Parking, and then I'm going to stop. Am I okay from the top?
Yep.
Is that all right? Parking. So I want to talk about parking because one of the kind of stories in the book, one of the themes in the book is about social change, moral change, the ways in which, through largely informal sources of control, encouragement, and so forth, we shift in the ways in which we think about things and do things. And oftentimes, these things happen quite slowly, but they change quite fundamentally. But they do so, if we go back to the dog mess example, they do so with a relative lack of fuss and a generally high level of compliance. The one example in the book, which is something of an exception to this story, is parking. Parking is really important for a whole host of reasons. Partly, as we know, the motor car, the motor vehicle is ubiquitous. There's massive expansion in the number of licensed motor vehicles on our roads. Though they're sold to us as things that move, motor vehicles are static. Motor vehicles don't move, on average, for more than 4% of the time. And when they're moving, a lot of the time, they're looking for somewhere to park. So parking is an absolutely extraordinary issue. And in some places, like Kensington and Chelsea, London Borough, not far from here, there are far more cars than there are parking spaces. Every single space in the London Borough of Kensington and Chelsea is a restricted parking space. The entire borough doesn't have a single unmarked parking space. And those parking spaces are divided into a huge range of different things, from residents to disabled bays, to school teachers and doctors, to diplomats, and you name it. There are something I counted them at one stage, sad man. And there are 30, 32, 33 different categories of parking. So on the one hand, what we've got is something which is enormously complex, and something which breeds, I think, as partly as a consequence, therefore, a lot of dissatisfaction. At heart here, though, as I was saying, there are relatively low levels of compliance. Roughly 16 million parking tickets are issued every year in the UK. About one for every 3 or 4 months. It's pretty significant. Not only 16 million parking tickets, but a very high level of dissatisfaction when the parking ticket is given. People think this is wrong, people resent it. Yeah, actually, in many cases, get very aggressive towards those poor people whose job it is to enforce these regulations. The best illustration of the reality of this, I think, is found in the mid-Wales town of Aberystwyth, in this university town of Aberystwyth in Ceredigion in mid-Wales. Small town, population expands 2, 3, 4-fold when the university is in term time. In, when was it? Precisely 1990. There was a shift away from police-based traffic enforcement in the 1990s. And what emerged were two systems side by side. So in some places outside London, the police continued to enforce traffic laws. In London, and increasingly outside, it was something that was delegated to local, given to local. Over time, over a period of about 10 years, the intention was that everything should become local authority managed. In Aberystwyth, or in Ceredigion, in that Welsh county, they managed to cock it up, basically. They failed to fill in their forms correctly. So that they stood down, the police made all their traffic wardens redundant. And at the end of the year that they were made redundant, the council had somehow failed to lodge the papers necessary to employ traffic wardens. So Aberystwyth, as a consequence, had a whole year without traffic wardens. The result, Armageddon, chaos, people parking all over the place, a complete failure or breakdown in this particular little bit of social order. It lasted for a year. They brought the traffic wardens back in, order restored. But it's a really interesting tale, I think, of, as I say, going in a slightly different or very different direction from many of the others. Here, formal control becomes very important. The absence of it actually leads to the breakdown of order. It's not just simple, it's actual. With the caveat that actually Ceredigion only has somewhere between 6 and 8 traffic wardens for the whole county. So even there, actually, a lot of this is again to do with self-management and self-governance, rather than the formalization of control. I'd better skip on to the end of this. I've talked for long enough. I'm going to go through the whole thing. Because this is reinforcing. A couple of very brief reflections to finish. Absolutely no claim or attempt, nor could one do so, I think, to answer the question of whether we're a more or less orderly society. What does that mean? We are, I think, a more ordered society. That is, across these areas, what one sees is a proliferation of rules and regulations and differentiation of expectations and the emergence of new laws. Underpinning so much of this, I think, as I was saying at the very beginning, is the identification and creation of new social bonds, whether that relates to what we do without pets, how we drink, how we smoke, or where we do these things. But in relation to those social problems, the rationales for intervention, the rationales for their creation, or for the reasons that we are expected to be concerned about these things vary. Health is often a very important initial staging post in the creation of social problems, but actually very often becomes superseded by a whole range of other matters, whether those be things relating to safety and security, whether it's about the management of public space or particular sections of the population, such as young people, or whether it's the effect of, however one wants to describe these things, economy, efficiency, effectiveness, new public management, or as it were, the emergence, the arrival, the increasing effect of a kind of neoliberal sensibility. But I've been using the word kind of responsible through this. The responsible citizen, the sensible drinker, the responsible driver, and so forth. A lot of these stories, I think, can be seen through as it were, a couple of conceptual lenses. But on the one hand, I think some of this makes sense using the language of governmentality, using the language of the conduct of conduct, the ways in which, through a whole variety of means, as it were, a series of expectations about how we will behave become instilled and embodied and embedded, and that we, in these different domains, are created and recreated as self-governing. But in many of these cases also, I think this is about civility. It's about what, they are examples, I think, also of the long-term impact of what Norbert Elias called the civilized. If we take just dogmas, for example, if the central argument of the civilizing process was about the ways in which, over time, in order to, as a consequence of the pacification of populations, that there's increasing social constraint to self-constraint. Expressing itself in a variety of ways, including increasing levels of shame around various forms of conduct. That I think it's not too far of a stretch, I'm hoping, to argue that the arrival of the biodegradable bag and the social expectation of picking up after dogs is simply one contemporary example of the extension of expectations around civility. It's a contemporary example of the impact of the civilized process, I think. And finally, then it's a story of social control. Stephen said at the very outset. But most importantly, I think, and I like to think of an uplifting tale, of an optimistic tale of the power of social interaction, of the importance of informal social control. With that, I will stop. Thank you.
Many thanks, Tim. We have about 15 minutes for questions and otherwise. Adam has waved his hand first. If you're online, it would be great if you put up your Zoom hand so I can see you.
Okay, Adam Oliver, LSE. I bet you didn't realise that you're an expert in behavioural public policy, did you? It's everybody that they're experts in. These are exactly the sorts of issues that behavioural public policy look at. My question to you is I know that you've finished this in a sense of like it's an uplifting tale, and I can see in many ways it is. Yeah. You know, I mean, I remember stepping in government all the time, and I was thankfully I don't do that quite so often now. But do you see problems with this kind of, this expansion of soft forms of social control, and that people might be controlled not through a sense of identification with the thing that they're being asked to do, but like you said, with a sense of shame or guilt or those sorts of things? any views on?
No, absolutely. I think it's a great question. Thanks, Adam. I mean, I was very kind of you to say expert, but I'm expecting to become an expert in behaviour and public policy next year. But it's a really good question, and I think absolutely, and it speaks to many of the things that are often, I think, asked in relation to, for example, food ID. You know, it's precisely that. You know, what are the dangers here? If we go to another one, you know, to what extent might we think of some of it in terms of something like panopticism? You know, the kind of ubiquity of surveillance, the everyday presence. So no, absolutely, I wasn't by an uplifting tale. I'm going to backtrack furiously in order. What I wanted to get at, I think, here was that what I want to take. One of the things I want to take from this is that it's that old kind of whatever sociological or criminological observation that formalized control, though important in some ways, is not the fundamental source of ordinance in the world that we inhabit, and that the kind of continued recourse to formalized means is deeply problematic. The uplifting bit of the story is that we, within limits, and come back to what you were getting at, within limits, you know, we are capable of being, I didn't get onto the pandemic, we are capable of being, in large part, an extraordinarily self-governing, self-managing, compliant, hence the problem captured in your question of the term compliance. Yeah, absolutely there are dangers, I think, in how far this goes and what the consequences of it are. So I'm not for a minute want to suggest that I think everything about this is optimistic and uplifting. But I think the story, I think the kind of claims around social control have a potentially positive form.
Thanks, Tim, for the fascinating and very entertaining talk. So, if I understood you correctly, you kind of concluded in the end that maybe there's a bit of a more ordered society. Now, what I was wondering, or at least I'd like to speculate about, is it really more ordered as a total, or is it more ordered in areas where kind of a need for more order became salient at the time, for whatever reasons, to protect the individual, let's say, health concern. And there might be other areas that have been more ordered previously, where that need has kind of diminished and it's gone away. So at an absolute level, it's not a more ordered society, but just have order if they are, let's say, sexual relations or something. Maybe it's less ordered than it was 50 years ago.
Yeah. So thank you, Thomas. And again, I think it's a very good question. There's another possibility in addition to the one that you were highlighting there, which is it's not about whether we're more or less ordered, or some areas are more ordered and other areas are less. The other possibility is that actually what we're talking about here is not more or less at all. It's the reconfiguration of order. Now, I think that second question, the one in the sense you didn't ask, but was implicit possibly in what you were saying, is the more challenging and problematic one for me. And it may well be that one needs to think about this more, and I need to think about this more in terms of reconfiguration and reorganization than in terms of more or less, which is the way I was casting. But to come back to your question, and I'd be interested in yours or other people's thoughts, because that is something, there's a sort of brief riff on it in the conclusion in the book, which is the question of, would this look the same if we took different areas, if we thought about other areas of social life? I mean, you mentioned whatever, sex and sexuality. You know, I actually think that could have an interesting conversation with it. I think that fits the pattern. You know, I think that sexual conduct, there are various things that we could look at in the post-war period, so the same historical period, around which you would say, whatever the language is, we're more liberal or more permissive or less restricted and so forth. But there are many other things around which I think in the kind of the sort of microphysics of it, around which there is much more with a small r regulation, the sort of the general talk, discourse, discussion, expectation, the sort of normative world in which those things take place is, I think, in many ways, a much more complex. So possibly sexuality fits the same model. I don't know, but are there other things one could think of that don't fit this pattern? When we were doing the round table thing, I was saying, a kind of vague idea about writing a book on. I think it's a very problematic term, but the microsociology of everyday life, or the sociology of everyday life, but it was precisely for this reason. So the kind of topics initially that are in this vague draft are eating, sleeping, talking, walking, sex, all of which I think fall into this pattern of areas of social life which are permeated by a whole variety of expectations, regulations, and on the go.
Yeah, please.
Thank you very much, Tim. I enjoyed that. Yes, more points of the question. It's to legislation. Now, in some of the areas we're talking about societal norms, social norms, others are talking about legislation. And I just wondered what role that played. And I think that one particularly because smoking, for example, you will remember it used to be like going into clubs and people by how horrendous it was. But it was legislation that resulted in those changes. And one of the big concerns about the government and the behaviour down the street during the pandemic, the actual pandemic, was to do with breaking the rules. So I just wondered what role is played by legislation and what is played by social norms, and can you differentiate this?
I think it's, the latter bit is deeply problematic. I mean, how you differentiate these things, I genuinely don't know. But to take the, I mean, to put it at its crudest, I think in most of these areas, legislation is more expressive or symbolic than it is instrumental and practical. It's not to say that it doesn't have instrumental and practical consequences, but broadly speaking, that would be the conclusion I would draw. The smoking example, 2006, 2006 Act, anyway, the one that banned public smoking came into force in 2007. I mean, I don't have the figures, but I'd hazard that the number of prosecutions under that legislation is tiny, absolutely tiny. What I draw from it is it was important in the, pubs wouldn't have started banning smoking. We would have, David Downs would have carried on smoking in his office. Yeah. People won't remember David, but etc. Were it not for legislation. But in the end, what changed behaviour? Well, a whole variety of things, but shifting social expectations were absolutely crucial. It's normative change in the end. Would that occur without legislation? No, in that case, it would not, or certainly not quickly. But the tipping point in that case is legislation, but the core job. And I think broadly that applies to the other areas. I think broadly, but I'm sure we could find some. I'm sure we can find changes. So the same is true of drink driving, seatbelts.
People didn't resist it either. I'm just saying they didn't resist the legislation, which they were expecting.
Yeah, no, they didn't. No, absolutely.
Thanks. Provide for.
Hi, couple. Still muted.
You're still muted.
Hi, Tim. Thank you for the great talk. Really fascinating. You said the idea of queuing being somehow unique to Britain is a conceit, and I completely agree with that. But in respect of the other things that you talked about, of how the other problems have been governed and managed, I just wanted to ask you whether there are elements there of what might be called British exceptionalism. Thank you.
Oh, do you have, sorry, thanks for the question, but do you have a more, what's your reason for asking that? I mean, do you have an example in your mind of what might look like British exceptionalism?
For example, you said that how the problem of the dog mess was created and sort of it came on the agenda. So when we look at Britain in a comparative perspective, was this problem also kind of created in countries of the developed world in the same way, or was it something of an exception to Britain? So,
in that particular example, I think broadly speaking, Britain is pretty typical. You know, I made brief reference to New York and to Paris. You know, there are differences, but those are really differences of degree rather than matters of principle or exceptionalism. So, you know, I think, and again, albeit I'm making a variety of claims here without necessarily having all the evidence to hand. I mean, so far as I know from my travels, you know, the picking up after dogs is now pretty well established and pretty well embedded in most of those countries with whom we would compare ourselves. But the thing you didn't ask, but which was implicit in your question, is to what extent are these changes in liberal democracies, developed liberal democracies, these Western changes? You know, to what extent would we see very different patterns of conduct and expectation and so forth in other societies? And I think we would and do. Now, you know, to what extent in India, the picking up after dogs would be a thing, or indeed how queuing occurs. I suspect it's reasonable to imagine it's quite different.
Very different. We have the Supreme Court of India taking up the case, taking up the problem of stray dogs. Stray dogs attacking people and killing many people. So yeah, it is a different problem altogether.
Yeah, and stray dogs was the issue that we went through 100 years before we started worrying about dog poop.
Yeah.
Great, Evelyn.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tim, for the engaging presentation of your book. Can you hear me well?
Yes, thank you.
Perfect. I think I'm approaching this through the lens of nationalism, and Michael Billig banal nationalism. This is about everyday representations of the nation, and this a sense of tribalism to national identity that can be shaped through TV, institutions, social norms and behaviors that coexist and that a lot of people take as granted and as normal. They don't even notice. And I was thinking your stories about dog poo and the role of institutions, local institutions, grassroots activities, and the way TV programs were involved in the whole process, but also you mentioned World War II and queuing and the importance of queuing in World War II. And now on one side, we've got institutions, TV, the presence of all this, that is like the underlying presence of these things that in this example of dog poo would shape behavior in society. With respect to World War II, we have a really important event that might have not shaped national identity, but in many sense remained an important event in the history of Britain. And you yourself mentioned the significant difference between us and other nations. And from the point of nationalism and doing national identities, to what extent do you think it's not only about sociological processes in general, but and social action and reaction, but also sociological processes and social action reaction with respect to this particular social identity? Thank you.
Thank you. So it's, if I've understood you correctly, it's the question there about to what extent there are, or perhaps you can repeat the core of it, particular events or these changes are linked either to those events or to shifts in the presentation of national identity?
Yes, I think to what extent do you think, if you look through the lens of the nation and nationalism, this present idea, like persistent, underlying, quiet idea of what the nation is, and of the way people do national identities and national identity as a type of social identity, to what extent these sociological processes actually also reflect doing national identities, shaping national identities? Does it make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Look, I mean, the sort of dog mess example, the queuing example becomes an unusual one in this case, in the sense it's the one that's most explicitly linked in some way or other to an imagined national identity, at least, or a claimed national identity. You know, I don't think that that's, off the top of my head at least, the case in relation to any of the other things that I've necessarily been talking about today. What's interesting, I think, is in some cases, some of the things that have happened, some of the ways in which we organize ourselves and behave, as it were, almost fly in the face of what is sometimes thought to be aspects of our imagined national identity. I'm thinking particularly here of drinking, where it's long been sort of thought and claimed and represented. British nation, or the English in particular, I should say, I want to be much clearer. The English have been presented as you know, the English youth in particular as having a deeply problematic relationship with alcohol and its use. And that's certainly been another, as it were, conceit, I think, about who we are and how national identity works. And yet, many of the things I think I would say about the ways in which alcohol and its consumption is organized and managed in this country would, thought about carefully, serve to undermine aspects of that imagined national identity. I don't know to what extent that speaks to your question.
Great.
Thank you.
Questions together, and that's it. So Lee, one at the back, and that's, can you ask them all together?
Great. So really interesting talk, and there's a bunch of things I could ask about, right, in terms of like international diffusion or cultural origins or this kind of thing. But I think the thing I'm interested in is like this parking case, right? This kind of why it doesn't fit. So I wonder if this is kind of like related to it being like a different type of collective action problem, right? So a lot of these are all kind of policy that are now enabling cooperation or better outcomes that wouldn't exist if there wasn't, right? So if I have dog poop, if I pick up my thing and everyone else is doing it, doesn't really change anything. If I'm a business thinking about having a smoking ban, if everyone else allows smoking, there's not really a market incentive to me necessarily. Alcohol, like if everyone else is drunk driving and I don't drunk drive, that doesn't really help me. Whereas the parking, I feel, is a bit different, because if people illegally park, technically then there's more legal park space as well, right? So if people behave better, that doesn't necessarily affect my ability to take advantage of it, because I can just also illegally park anyway. If they illegally park, then there's more open stuff for them. So I wonder whether there's where it doesn't solve the collection action problem in the same way, and that's why there's a difference with parking.
Sorry?
Yeah, I've been trying to think about ways that Britain's becoming less orderly and whether there are any. And I was
Sorry, how come?
thinking about declining standards in public life and politicians behaving badly. And you can think, okay, well, so everybody was really outraged about like kind of all this corruption and sleaze that's coming out more and more. But I think actually the public are less shocked than ever by it and more kind of becoming a bit numb to it, to say that maybe it is becoming normalized. But maybe also it's just that elites are behaving badly and it's more visible than it's ever been, you know. But I do wonder if we are normalizing bad behavior in public life and actually like taking away these ethical standards and stuff. So yeah, maybe that's disorder.
Thank you. Final question?
Yeah, just picking up on that point, I'm just sort of thinking about that as well. I wondered if one part of this might be speech or expression is less ordered. And some people would say speech is more policed than ever before. But I think about the internet, social media, Twitter in some sense, like the internet is not a place. So is that a place where actually it's chaos in a way that gives people freedom to express themselves in a way that what it sounds like from your talk they're not able to do in other aspects of their in real life?
It's an interesting one. Then can I take them in reverse order? So just very quickly, I know we're running out of time. Thanks for all the questions. So look, I mean, speech and public life. Speech, I mean, I think you may have hit upon, as it were, a space, which virtual space, where there's a kind of regulatory anarchy, and where people get to do and speak and express in ways which are not possible in the non-virtual world. But that tells the important story about social organization and social order, I think, which is precisely that speech and talk and language, I think, is a little bit like the conversation that Thomas and I were having about sexuality, which is you can identify a variety of ways in which things are liberalized and more permissive. You know, it was extraordinarily shocking in the mid-1960s, when the theatre critic Kenneth Tynan first used the word fuck on television. It caused an absolute avalanche of shock, criticism, and so forth. We now live in an age where, after the watershed, and the word watershed tells us something important here, it would be extraordinary if Gordon Ramsay uttered a sentence without it. Yeah? So it looks like, superficially, like a more liberal, more permissive world, but actually, precisely what you're saying, I think, language is extraordinarily, minutely now, as it were, governed, what's the better phrase, I think. It's much more complex. I was buying myself time partly there about public life. I don't know about public life, and I wonder, you know, clearly there's something, you know, politically there's something really weird going on, not just in this country, but other countries. And you rightly, you know, use words like ethics and so forth. But I mean, again, one those just very crudely, as it's very crude, so I can come at this in two ways. You know, what looks like disorderly conduct is disorderly conduct, if you like, from one perspective, is actually about the nature of social expectations from the other. You know, and so it's again, I don't have an answer to your question really. I think I think it's a fascinating one. I mean, what I need to think about before. I mean, I suspect at heart this is another example of just as a deeply kind of nuanced and complex area. Liam, the collective action problem. I don't know. I'm not sure about that. You know, I've been struggling with this parking thing and what it is. I mean, I think there is something different about the nature of, as it were, if one can even use the term, social interaction when people are in front. Yeah, you know, people have used phrases like long before Joanna Rowling. You know, people have used phrases like invisibility. People within motor vehicles behave in ways very clearly that they don't behave when they're outside motor vehicles. They use language. There are for people who are into weird sociological and psychological studies, there are studies of nose picking. It's fascinating. Yes, people do a whole variety of things that they wouldn't do elsewhere because they imagine that they're not what. Partly, I think, the unusualness of parking is to do with the nature of the motor car and what happens to people. It's partly about scarcity, okay, and the pressures of scarcity, and some of it, I think, involves what sociologists, criminologists from years ago would have called techniques of neutralization. We, as it were, we find means of rationalizing publicly our behavior, our failure to abide by rules in ways which both defend our behavior but allow us to imagine that we are otherwise rule abiding. I suspect there's more about it, and I need to think more about your collective action. But that's my topic to the
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
anyway, great start.
Thank you.
So as Adam hinted, we continue the theme with, but he's explicitly about behavioural public policy. So Adam in this room in a week's time.